So, good morning, everyone. Hello. Shh. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the second of the EmTech masterclasses. I'm very happy to welcome Achim back to the AA. Achim was a student in undergrad school, did his diploma with honors. And when we founded EmTech, he was our first Studio Master. It was really kind of quite an artificial division because the three of us were just doing the different roles that the stuff we're interested in. And Achim has always had a really strong intuition as well as an ability to study and work on computational systems. He founded ICD, the youngest ever professor at Stuttgart University, I think, 3 years ago. And we admire and still keep in contact and follow his work closely. So please welcome Achim Menges.
Yep. Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. It's always a great pleasure to be back at the AA. And I actually realized that it's exactly 10 years since I started that job as Studio Master in EmTech this fall. So somehow time flies, but what you will see is that a lot of the work that I will show in the next hour is somehow very much rooted in the work that we did at EmTech in those days. And I think I have to owe a lot of my interests to this collaboration with Mike and Michael and George here at the A, and we're trying to sort of develop that line a little bit further in Stuttgart. I think what I will try to do in the lecture is, because I assume this is more like an expert audience, I will not go through all kinds of different projects, but I will rather sort of introduce the overarching sort of theoretical framework in which we work, and then I will try to explain 4 projects in greater detail so that you get an understanding of the actual design research, not just looking at this kind of fancy images. I think at the beginning it's probably important to realize that the idea behind the Institute is that computation, in its most basic meaning, really refers to the processing of information. So in this way, both machinic processes that operate in the binary realm of the digital, as well as material processes that actually operate in the more complex domain of the physical, can actually be considered computational. So I think we may all agree that there's quite a strong bias towards what one could call machine computation in contemporary design, but there have also been some occasional instances of what we call material computation in architecture, and I will show a couple of them later on. What has rarely been explored is sort of the territory where these two fields overlap and where they not simply coexist, but where they really intensely interact in the design process, which is somehow the focus of our investigations. So operating at that overlap of machine and material computation somehow entails integrating material information, and that is actually the behaviors originating in materiality and the constraints that emanate from materialization within the sort of computation design process. And it really suggests a conception of material not as a passive receptor of shape, as I would argue is quite emblematic for current digital design approaches, but rather as an active generator of form, which may found its conceptual roots in the morphogenetic processes of becoming in nature. So over the last 10 years, the focus of my research at various institutions has been the development of such a morphogenetic design approach, one in which materialization and design computation are somehow inherently and inseparably related. And I think there's an interesting history of such an approach that can be actually traced to some of the probably most radical and influential academic ventures of the 20th century, in this case actually in Germany. So on the one hand, you may actually refer to Joseph Albers' studies at the Bauhaus, which established a precedent for the possible enrichment of design processes through what he called material experimentation. It's interesting to note that Albers actually rejected processes of materialization that were based on professional craft knowledge, claiming that they actually stifled invention. And instead, he identified the material behavior itself as a kind of creative domain for developing new modes of construction and innovation. So in this way, the material studies that they did were really not conceived as sort of scalar models or representations of ideas, but as temporary unfoldings of material behavior in space and time. On the other hand, I think Frei Otto's quite extensive work and experiments at his institute at the University of Stuttgart that studied what he actually called form-finding methods may serve as an example of the other end of the spectrum of a kind of material-oriented design approach, because Otto investigated a kind of vast number of different material systems, such as, for example, the seminal soap films and related cable nets that you can see here, in order to study the capacity of material physically computing form as the equilibrium state of internal restraints and external forces. So I think within the contemporary context of design computation and digital fabrication, I still like to think about our research as a possible extension and synthesis of both sort of Alber's experimental approach of employing material as a driving force in the creative process and Otto's scientific rigor in conducting architectural inquiry. So what I basically will present today are 4 fields of design research and related projects on materiality, materialization, material structure, and finally material performance, which may really allow to think of a more sort of exploratory design culture and integrative material practice of architecture, even though I'm fully aware that what we can offer at this moment are only sort of the merest beginnings and quite modest contributions. So in the first chapter, I will really focus on materiality with the aim of showing how an approach to design computation may allow to understand material not so much as a kind of something that is superimposed on form, but rather as something that is a generator for design. So in order to show such an approach, or how such an approach allows exploring new facets of even relatively mundane building materials, I will focus actually some part of the presentation on wood, but it's important to realize that we actually are not limited to this material. In fact, we investigate a vast range of different materials. For example, we have worked quite a bit on composite materials and have developed design environments and design tools for exploring the particular behavior of, for example, 3D warp-knitted textiles, which in this case led to the design and production of a series of monocoque furnitures that are all based on the specific behavior of the spacer textile and thus actually don't require elaborate molds, which we further explored in the design of sort of more complex composite shell constructions, such as these media stations for a library in Norway, and even self-forming composite surfaces that are based on gathering patterns of the 3D textile, which form then secondary skin articulations that considerably enhance the structural capacity of these systems. Over many years, we have also investigated membrane structures, most recently through the quite amazing doctoral research of Sean Alquist, who is also a former EmTech graduate at my institute, who is actually investigating spatial membrane systems and is developing quite a sophisticated software environment for the design and production of complex tension-active structures, which he continuously sort of tests and validates through large-scale prototypes. And more recently, he has even sort of accomplished the possibility, or investigated and accomplished the possibility of integrating bending active frames of elastically bent carbon fiber rods into these membrane systems so that they become actually self-supporting structures that are in equilibrium, and that can be actually further enhanced by additional layers of articulation through CNC-produced, specially made textiles. Another example, and I choose those because they're both from EmTech graduates, is probably the work of Carola Dierichs, who investigates granular substances for architecture. That may be the other end of the spectrum when it comes to material systems. And she investigates how the behavior of such granular substances that are based on designed macroparticles can actually be explored through machine and material computation. So what is really interesting about the physics of these kind of aggregate structures is that they combine the stable character of a solid material and the kind of adaptability of a fluid, suggesting that the emergent spatial structures can not only be functionally graded through the design of the particles, but they can also be rapidly reconfigured. So why all these systems are actually quite interesting, I will focus the next part of the presentation on wood, which somehow begs the question, why would one actually really want to sort of invest time in sort of investigating a kind of innovative computation design approach by focusing on what initially seems to be a fairly archaic material? Well, I think in the light of the environmental challenges the built environment is facing, it is increasingly recognized that there are hardly any other materials that can rival wood's environmental virtues. It is a naturally renewable material that holds a very low level of embodied energy and has a positive carbon footprint. However, as you all know, in contrast to most other construction materials that are somehow specifically designed and industrially produced to satisfy the needs and requirements of the building sector, wood actually grows as the functional tissue of trees, resulting in a very differentiated fibrous cellular structure. Now, the design opportunities that are somehow innate in this heterogeneous makeup of wood are usually completely neglected in today's construction practice. And wood is really most often dumped down to yet another dimensional building element, which I think the US naming conventions is most emblematic for this situation, where it's not even called wood anymore, just sort of 2x2, 2x4 or whatever. So in contrast to this sort of disregard of the interesting material makeup of the material, or the kind of cellular makeup of the material, I would argue that computation processes allow for a renewed appreciation of the amazing differentiation and surprising behavioral capacities that are inherent in wood's complex anatomy. Thus, the design research projects that we have conducted and that I will show began all with investigations on the microscopic level. So once you actually look into sort of the microstructure and ultrastructure of wood, you can see that it can be described as a natural fiber composite. Because in the various layers of the wood cell, most prominently in the S2 layer, the cellulosic microfibrils function like fibers that reinforce a matrix of lignin and hemicellulose in which they are embedded. As such, it's also interesting to note that wood shares a number of properties with synthetic composites, such as, for example, glass fiber reinforced plastics, that are characterized by relatively low stiffness combined with relatively high structural capacity. You know that, for example, from glass fiber poles of pole vaulters, they bend a lot, but they still have the structural capacity to throw the vaulter over the bar. So what is interesting is that these properties and the related material behavior is actually very well suited for construction techniques that employ the elasticity of wood to form complex lightweight structures from initially very simple planar building elements. So obviously that begs the question how one could actually imagine an architectural design process that enables such material behaviors to become an active driver in the generation of form, structure, and space. And this question was investigated in the first project that I would like to show in a bit more detail, which was the ICD-ITKE Research Pavilion, which is actually a collaborative work of researchers and students of my institute and the Institute of Jan Knippers. So at the core of this project is really the awareness that any material has the ability to compute form. And a good example, and probably a very simple example, is the one that you can see here, is the specific figure that a strip of plywood finds once it is exposed to a force at one of its support points. So you know you don't actually form the piece of wood, you just pull on one end and then you get this kind of parabolic shape for free. However, despite the fact that this sort of elastic material behavior offers interesting architectural possibilities and possibly even structural advantages, it is hardly ever used in architecture because it lies outside of what we can design with our conventional design techniques, including actually most digital ones. So in other words, as we as architects can usually simply not draw or model material behavior, we can usually not design with it. There are really only very few examples of such elastically bent architectures, and it may not come as a surprise that vernacular architecture, with its far more immediate sort of relation to material behavior, has recognized their capacity. For example, the Madan people in southern Iraq used the elastic behavior of bundled reeds to construct their houses. In addition to these culturally evolved examples, there are a few technologically derived bending active structures, such as the timber cridges that were developed by Frei Otto in the 1970s. And what is interesting about them is that here, an initially entirely flat and regular wooden lattice is actually assembled flat on the ground, as you can see in the upper left image. And then once it is jacked up only at a few strategic points, it finds its structurally stable double curved form completely by itself based on the elastic behavior of the wooden elements. So in many ways, our project aimed at further developing this quite often overlooked lineage of bending active architectures. And based on a discussion we had with Frei Otto, we identified actually two design research goals for this undertaking. The first is that the project aimed for integrating the skin and the structure in one monomaterial bending active system with no need for any additional cladding elements. And the second aim was that, in contrast to the aforementioned grid shells, here the aim was really to use the elastic bending behavior not so much to generate the overall sort of global shape, but rather to define a series of behavioral components that spatially mediate an intricate network of forces. So this project, as all projects, begin with physical tests, in this case of the bending deformation of the thin birch plywood strips and related finite element simulations. And based on these physical as well as computation tests, the bending behavior of the material was actually investigated and developed towards a basic structure that employs the bending behavior in local segments than the overall arc. So this system actually it's quite simple, and it really consists only of planar strips, which you can nicely see in this material simulation here, that are subsequently connected in such a way that the elastically bent and tension regions alternate along their lengths. And this is interesting because the force that is locally stored in each bent region of the strip and maintained by the corresponding tensile region of the neighboring strip actually increases the structural capacity of the system. So this, you may call that the kind of behavioral system, was then transferred into a constructional system with the aim to produce the entire structure with one machine and one tool only. Thus, all the relevant details are really based on the constraints of the machine that we wanted to use, which is actually our fabrication robot. So, for example, we developed a tension puzzle joint in order to connect strip segments of limited stock size. And another critical morphological feature is obviously the articulation of the strip outline, because this regulates the overall modulation of the transparency, the enclosure and exposure of the envelope, as well as the natural lighting conditions and the interaction with artificial light during nighttime. The most critical detail is obviously the point where these strips are actually connected. And it's not difficult to detect that these connection points are local weak spots because they have only a very reduced structural depth. So I think you don't have to study structural engineering to understand that where the strips actually cross, you get actually a kind of structural problem. However, we found a way to somehow distribute these local weak spots within the overall system in such a way that they don't compromise the stability of the global system. So as you can see nicely in this paper model here on the left and the photograph of the actual structure on the right, this is achieved by letting the locations of the joints oscillate along the structure, which means that you prevent any sort of larger areas or axes of weakness to occur, and also results in quite a distinctive articulation of the envelope. So the distribution of these joint points that spatially mediate the material behavior of the plywood lamellas became one of the main drivers in the computation design process. Because here, sort of strategically introducing irregularity allows achieving global stability. This was then again corroborated with a finite element analysis that simulates the bending of the initially planar segments or planar strips, and you can see quite nicely how the final shape is really the resulting equilibrium state of all interacting elastic elements. So I think the simulation shows very well how the behavior of the employed material computes the shape of the pavilion. Obviously, the structurally required irregularity then results also in actually unique building elements, which meant that we had to produce more than 500 geometrically different parts, but that wasn't a problem because we could sort of streamline that data flow directly to the robot. And then what is really interesting is that in contrast to the substantial sort of intellectual investment in developing these kind of design processes and simulations, the final system and assembly is actually surprisingly straightforward. Basically, the simple planar strips just need to be connected, and then they find their specific shape entirely by themselves. So in other words, even in full scale on site, the material itself computes the shape of the pavilion. The final sort of pavilion's equilibrium state unfolds quite a unique architectural space, while at the same time being actually extremely efficient with the employed material resources. Actually, the combination of the pre-stress that results from the elastic bending in the assembly process and the morphological differentiation of the joint locations allows using only extremely thin plywood strips. In fact, the entire structure, which has a diameter of more than 12 meters, could be constructed using birch plywood with a thickness of only 6.5 millimeters. So it's something like this. It's actually not even considered to be a construction material. It's usually just used to actually for the interior of fans or lorries. So this super thin skin is at the same time the load-bearing structure, which also needed to actually fulfill the stringent regulations of a German building application, which we always need for these prototypical buildings. So we have to go through the whole process of sort of validating that it is structurally stable in regards to wind loads, snow loads, and it fulfills all requirements of a building regulation. And the envelope is at the same time the light modulating and weather protecting skin, which actually in this way was designed in such a way that it touches the ground topography on the street-facing corner of the site in order to define a kind of edge of the university campus. And in contrast to this, the other side that faces the public square was lifted up to form quite a large free-spanning opening. Inside, the toroidal space could actually never really be perceived in its entirety, leading to quite a surprising spatial depth that was further enhanced by the sequence of direct and indirect illumination that results from the convex and concave undulations of the envelope. So in addition to these explorations of the architectural possibilities, the construction of the research project also allows a more scientific sort of validation of the presented computation design approach, which was actually done by comparing these four models. So what you see here is on the upper left, the computation design model, which is based on about 6,000 lines of code. It takes 2 minutes to compute the shape of the pavilion. You have the finite element, fully fledged material simulation. It takes about 2 days to calculate the shape of the pavilion. Then you have the robot control code model on the bottom left. And then you have the scan of the actual pavilion sort of the way that the material computed the shape on site. And this scan was actually done by repeatedly digitizing the pavilion with the help of geodesic engineers of the University of Stuttgart using full-scale scanning equipment, which resulted in a huge point cloud, actually more than 160 million points, but we could actually write an algorithm that allowed us to extract the critical measure points and overlay them with the computation design model, which actually in the end showed only minor deviations. So comparing the results of the generative computation design process, which you can see here on the sort of in the upper half, with the exact measurements of the pavilion as the digital scan that you can see here on the bottom, somehow the geometry that the material computed on site really indicates that this integration of material behavior in the design process is not an idealized goal, but quite a feasible proposition. More importantly, probably, the project demonstrates how focusing the computation design process on material behavior rather than shape allows for unfolding performative capacity and material resourcefulness, while at the same time expanding the design space towards formerly unknown or unexplored architectural possibilities. Here, somehow material is no longer a passive receptor of shape, but really an active generator of design. So in addition to the sort of investigations of the design potential inherent in materiality, we are also quite interested in further exploring the possibilities of materialization, which in architecture we usually call sort of production and fabrication, which leads us to the next chapter. I think we don't have to discuss that digital fabrication has already changed architecture to quite a degree, but if you really come to think of it, it is still sort of used in a way that is more facilitative rather than generative. So we were interested in seeing how we can actually systematically capture the specific affordances and constraints of any specific fabrication environment so that they can become the point of departure of architectural inquiry and systematic design research. In this context, it's actually interesting to note that in architecture, we are often fascinated by the sheer diversity of natural forms. However, in biology, there's actually a field of research that is called theoretical morphology that investigates why out of all the theoretically possible forms, only actually relatively few come to exist in nature. And in these studies, the concept of so-called morphospaces is employed to describe not yet existent form. So in the early 1960s, the paleontologist David Raub actually published quite a seminal paper in Science, which was entitled Theoretical Morphology of the Coiled Shell, in which he presented a series of computer-generated shell forms that you can see here on the left. This is actually before architects got their hand on computers. It's around the same time that Sutherland developed Sketchpad at MIT, which then went on to become the first CAD system. So using the three critical form parameters as coordinate axes, he then went on to construct a three-dimensional space of all computable shell forms, which you can see as the cube on the right in this illustration, into which he mapped all the shell morphologies that are actually known in biology. Essentially, basically, differentiating what he called the empirical morphospace of physically existing form, which is the gray zone, from the theoretical morphospace, and that is the remaining white region, that includes all sort of geometrically possible forms. So in the next project, we investigated the transfer of this concept from theoretical morphology to design computation and robotic fabrication, so that at the very onset of the design process, the space of the physically producible can be identified and differentiated from the geometrically possible. And this was actually done by another one of these research pavilion projects, which was again a collaborative undertaking of researchers and students from my institute, the Institute of Young Knippers, and other members of the German Biomedics Competence Network, including some experts from biology and biomechanics. So this project in contrast to the other one that actually really focused on the material behavior initially, began with an investigation how digital production processes allow for an extension of what is actually quite a traditional wood jointing technique. So the system we developed is derived from two technological innovations. On the one hand, a special tool that was custom made by one of our industrial partners for this project, which allows for simultaneously cutting at the tip and the edge of the tool, and obviously the use of an industrial robot. And in combination, these two things enabled the development of robotically fabricated finger joints that make it possible to join blades at various different angles and even with different thicknesses, resulting in complex blade structures of multiple blades connected in diverse angles, but still maintaining the traditional finger joint's advantage of not requiring any additional mechanical or adhesive, sort of mechanical fasteners or adhesives. So based on our specific robot setup, which in this case included a turntable as a 7th axis on which the part to be fabricated is mounted, we identified 3 critical morphological parameters of the finger joint wood blades. The first one is the connection angle that defines the angle between the adjacent blades, then the polygon angle that expresses the shape of the blade, and the polygon radius that captures the size of the blade. And by using a setup-specific robot fabrication simulation, we were able to identify the min-max ranges for these morphological parameters, and we mapped them into what we have termed a machinic morphospace, which is defined by coordinate axes that actually represent these morphological parameters. So within this theoretical morphospace of all geometrically possible blades, which you can see here on the bottom left, the machinic morphospace emerges that only includes the actually fabricable blade morphologies, here shown, for example, for a 6-axis robot setup or for our 7-axis robot setup. So now, with having somehow identified the possible space of the physically producible, it's obviously an interesting question how to navigate this space and how to explore its particularly promising regions. And in this context, I very much like the quote of Julian Vincent, which said that in biology, material is expensive, but shape is cheap. And as of today, the opposite was true in the case of technology, which is a situation that arguably, with the introduction or the shift from serial to digital production, has somewhat changed. So one interesting aspect in mapping the constraints of materialization into a kind of morphospace is that it opens up the possibility to employ, for example, biomimetic design strategies to explore the particularly promising regions within that space, which really allows for unfolding performative capacity from morphological differentiation rather than surplus materials. It's also clear that in order to do so, you really have to understand a little bit the structural behavior of these finger joints. That's also not so difficult because it's quite obvious that you can imagine that these joints are quite good in transferring shear stresses along the edges. No? If you want to move this thing here, it actually is quite stable, but they're also very weak in transferring bending moments or even tensile stresses. I mean, can hardly take this. So if you consider that it's actually only a viable joint for transferring shear, constitutes quite a considerable challenge for the design of a larger sort of blade structure. However, there are natural systems that have evolved ways of successfully exactly sort of addressing this challenge. For example, the sand dollar, which actually belongs to the class of Echinoida, or actually sea urchins, has a blade skeleton that consists of discrete polygonal blades, as you can nicely see here. So if you find these sand dollars on the beach, you know that you can actually dismantle them and you're left with these small polygonal blades that form the skeleton of the sea urchin. And what is fascinating about these blades is that they are connected by stereon projections that are very similar to finger joints, and that the sand dollar has obviously developed particular blade morphologies that really capitalize on the finger joint structure behavior by more or less evolving shells that transfer all the forces that are acting on them into shear forces along the blade edges, and thus they almost entirely avoid bending moments at these connections. So with the help of the biologists, we identified 8 relevant biomimetic design principles that govern this performative behavior and captured them in algorithmic rules that were embedded in a computation design process. And this process still allows actually for quite a high degree of spatial modulation, for example, through topological transformations of infolding and splitting, while at the same time ensuring consistency with the complex reciprocities between, on the one hand, the physically producible, and on the other hand, the performative, which was again sort of iteratively tested and calibrated. So the resultant computation process really enables the designer to explore the machinic morphospace of the physically producible somehow through the filter of the biomimetic design rules, which in concert with spatial and contextual criteria leads in this case to a highly specific blade morphology. So this articulation of the envelope results in high structural performance and quite a distinctive architectural character, which in the end both stem from the morphological differentiation of the blade system. On the other hand, obviously, this differentiation requires the fabrication of a vast amount of different parts, in this case more than 850 different blades with more than 100,000 different finger joints, of which you can see the spatial mapping of the required robot control in this image. However, as the logics of materialization were a driver of the design process, all the kind of necessary topological sorting of the elements and the sort of required generation of the robot code form an integral part of the computation process, so that we could actually somehow extract all the materialization information directly from the design model. So here you can nicely see how the plates are produced. They are mounted on this robotically controlled turntable. Then they are trimmed. That has already happened before the video started. And then the robot actually cuts the finger joints, as you can see here now, in one go. So it's actually a relatively fast process. The production of one plate takes about 3 to 4 minutes. And the precision is about in the 1/10 of a millimeter, because it's really the tool that defines the precision of the joint. So again, in contrast to the considerable complexity of the design process, the resulting system is surprisingly simple and actually cheap. Basically, you end up with a huge puzzle of finger joint blades that are assembled into individual modules without the need for any special tools or heavy technical equipment. And you can see that once these modules are fully assembled, despite being relatively made from very thin wood, they are formed structurally stable components. And there was a vast range of different shapes of that, where you can also see the kind of morphological range that is possible with the robotic fabrication. And in the end, it's kind of a modular assembly system that we built from the ground up, which turned out to be sort of difficult because it leaves very little margins for tolerance compensation. But despite the fact that we had no time to build any prototype, so the first blade we actually manufactured ended up in the actual structure. The construction went pretty well, with only minor tolerances between the modules and comparatively small deviations between the structures, sort of as planned and as built, which we again checked through a comprehensive laser scan of the entire system. So I think on that image on the right, on the top, you can nicely see the resolution of these laser scans nowadays, which is almost like a 3D photograph. And on the bottom, you can see a mapping of the deviations between the computational geometry and the actual geometry. So the resulting lightweight modular wood shell quite nicely demonstrates both the structural capacity and the architectural potential of a system that exclusively consists of extremely thin plywood plates that are connected only by these robotically fabricated finger joints. So based on the systematic exploration of the machinic morphospace, the system reveals the spatial capacity to overcome the somewhat hermetic character of many other shell architectures. For example, and I think that's something you can quite nicely see in this image, enabling the system to come back onto itself creates a kind of oculus that visually connects the interior with the surrounding park, basically resulting in two kinds of spaces. A truly internal space that is characterized by the perforation of the inner skin layer that is actually required for the assembly of the double-layered modules, which was also used for an indirect LED illumination, and a kind of interstitial space that opens up at the situation where the inner and the outer layer bifurcate, where no perforation is required and somehow the construction logic of the system is revealed. So as the structural performance here really results from each element's highly specific morphological response to the flow of forces, the entire pavilion with a diameter of more than 12 meters could actually build using extremely thin plates again. So all the plates actually, without any exception, have only a thickness of 6.5 millimeters again. So that's that thick, resulting in a very lightweight and materially efficient structure that actually manages to enclose 200 cubic meters of space with just 2 cubic meters of wood. So it's a kind of 1 to 100 ratio. As a non-programmed semi-interior urban space at the campus of Stuttgart University, the pavilion also sort of provided quite a popular meeting point and lunch location. And I think overall the project shows how embedding the logics of materialization in a morphogenetic computation process enables the designer to somehow offset the conventional economies of construction. Here, a substantial intellectual investment in the design process really results in a surprisingly simple and cheap system that yet yields novel architectural possibilities while at the same time offering a high level of material efficiency and performative capacity. What's also quite interesting to note is that the morphology of the sand dollar is quite an exceptional natural system in the sense that it follows sort of relatively common logics of building construction, which is based on the assembly of a structure from modules consisting of discrete elements. In contrast to that, most biological systems follow quite a different logic in which a clear distinction between material and structure is not possible. Here, materiality is really constructed as an integrative material structure of continuous elements organized across multiple scales of hierarchy. And this is somehow the focus of the third part of our research that I would like to introduce again along the example of the research pavilion that we are just about to finish this week or at the beginning of next week. So this is not fully finished yet, but I think it's still interesting to introduce to make the point. This is again a collaborative undertaking of researchers and students of my institute, the Institute of Jan Knippers, but in this case also involved biologists from the departments of evolutionary biology and paleontology of invertebrates at the University of Tübingen, and textile and composite engineers from the Institute of Textile Technology and Process Engineering, ITV Denkendorf. So, as I already said, different to the previous pavilion, which was really a shell that was built up from differentiated yet discrete modular elements, in this project we were interested in almost sort of the opposite approach of an entirely continuous shell in which the material structure itself is constructed and differentiated through robotic fabrication. And an interesting natural example of such a structure is the exoskeleton of the American lobster, which we also investigated here at the EmTech a couple of years ago, almost sort of 6-7 years ago now. What is interesting about that, and that's maybe something that you all know by now, is that the so-called cuticula of these exoskeletons appears initially as a fairly monolithic shell, but under the microscope it reveals a highly differentiated structure that is organized across several levels of hierarchy. And although everything is essentially one material, the build-up and the orientation of the chitin fibers allows the microstructure to very specifically respond to local requirements, resulting actually in considerably different material behavior within different regions of the exoskeleton, which you can nicely see in this comparison of the stress-strain behavior of the crusher claw, the pincher claw, and the membrane that is the connective elements between these shared structures. This research was obviously not done by us, but by colleagues at the Max Planck Institute around the same time, actually. So what we did is that in collaboration with the biologists, the students and researchers actually carefully investigated different parts of the lobster shell, which they studied under the microscope to identify different fiber organizations, such as the strongly parallel fiber arrangements here, or the helicoidal fiber structures in this image, as well as more complex situations of the cuticular morphology and related fiber layouts. Now, because the logic of this sort of natural fiber composite systems is quite closely related to fiber-reinforced plastics, we also began to investigate new manufacturing technologies for glass and carbon fiber composites, such as Northale's 3DL technology. This is actually not such a new technology any longer. It's almost 10 years that they construct the sails for racing yachts by laying down the fibers individually. So we had the technical director of Northales coming over to Germany, and we obviously discussed with him that this way of constructing a composite shell is not viable for architecture, because it means that you have to build your entire sort of building as a mold before you construct then the actual construction system. So what we did is different to these fiber layout systems that require a comprehensive, complex 3D mold. We developed a process of robotic filament winding, which reduces the mold to a linear framework, which we tested and refined through a series of smaller scale mock-ups, as you can see in this video. So what really happens is that you have a temporary scaffold that is very simple, linear elements, and on that, a double curved surface is actually constructed by laying down the fibers in this filament winding process. So having established the basic robot programming logics, which in this case is really not a trivial undertaking, because the way you lay down the fibers is quite different with the fibers location, or the location of fibers in which they end up, we conducted a series of mechanical tests in order to understand the actual behavior of the resultant fiber structures. So, as mentioned, in this case, it's not that you can actually just look up the material properties in a textbook, but you have to sort of identify the specific behavior that results from the manufacturing processes. So based on these tests and the biological principle, this was then related to regions of different fiber organizations within the overall logic of the robotic filament winding morphology, of which you can see here actually a physical model indicating the glass fiber direction in white and the carbon fiber direction in black. So the idea was that we construct a kind of surface using glass fiber, and on that we lay actually carbon fiber rovings that then are actually really the load-bearing structure. So for example, you get regions of unidirectional carbon fiber arrangements at the support points and more helicoidal glass fiber organizations at the shell's closed side, which was again iteratively checked through structural simulations. So based on this, a syntax for the fiber placement was developed to articulate architectural situations, such as an entrance location that you can see here, or a kind of roof morphology that you can see in this slide. And this resulted in quite a comprehensive method for developing a related design technique and design tool that unfolds quite a rich repertoire of possible architectural morphologies, while at the same time remaining coherent with the logics on constraints of the robotic filament winding process. So the robot control code here was derived by doing a lot of these kind of simulations, which allow one to see in how far the kind of lay down of the fibers corresponds to the control of this sort of seven-axis setup again. You can imagine that the resultant interrelation between the geometry that you plan, the fiber layup, the resultant fiber organization, and the actual structure behavior is, again, not very straightforward, so that we actually had to test and simulate that quite frequently, and in the end we were able to optimize that mainly through the engineering competence from the ITKE, so that we could actually achieve a maximum stiffness from the fibers that we wanted to lay down. So compared to the previous two pavilions that I presented, that could actually be produced within the sort of cozy atmosphere of our lab, this project required a far more involving fabrication setup actually on site, where the pavilion is produced on a temporary scaffold that is mounted on this robotically controlled turntable. So in this case, we really first had to build a pretty large tent, because you have to have somehow a controlled environment in which you use these materials. Then we needed to get a much bigger robot. In this case, this is the kind of latest KUKA, which has a 4-meter long arm. And then we had to quite precisely fabricate the temporary steel scaffolding that obviously will be taken out after the winding process. So after this temporary scaffold was completed, we used actually the robot to scan the scaffold, and then one late night in August, the frame started to spin and the first glass fiber rawings were laid, as you can nicely see in this video. What I also like is that the researchers all have their hands in the pocket, because there's nothing left for them to do, just watch. Because it is actually, in the end, a fully optimized process. So here you can nicely see, this is actually a dry run, where the fibers are laid without being saturated with resin. But in the subsequent, and I will show you a video of that in a second, the fibers actually run through a resin bath before they are laid. So they are laid in a kind of wet state. Let's move on. So through this more or less fully automized process, the shell is built up of successive layers of glass and carbon fiber winding. And I think this video shows also quite nicely how the fibrous layers actually interact in the process of, in the winding process. For example, here you see the quite distinct curved shape of the carbon fiber, which really results from the way that the underlying sort of glass fiber surfaces actually form. So then we can move to my favorite video. It's actually looking at that from the viewpoint of the robot, laying down the fibers, and here you can see that the fibers are wet and already saturated with the resin. So they are laid on in an iterative mode, and then they're just drying out, and in the end the whole structure is actually tempered by heating it up to 60 degrees. You can also see that it's a pretty rapid process. So if everything would go smooth, you could actually produce the entire pavilion in about 2 weeks. But things never go smooth somehow. So as mentioned, the production is not completed yet. Another 5 layers of carbon and glass fiber will be actually added to what you see in this image, forming at least partially a closed surface. So I think we're definitely facing another interesting couple of moments at the end of this week or the beginning of next week. For example, when we take the temporary scaffold out but the preliminary results and the kind of precision of the fiber layup, both in regards to the fiber interaction and the winding process, as well as the local fiber articulation that you can see here on the right, are actually fairly encouraging. So we were quite surprised how well this kind of winding process works and the kind of precision you can achieve with it. So here you can see a snapshot of the current state of the winding process, and eventually the final shell will consist of more than 30 kilometers of robotically laid glass and carbon fibers, but it will remain to be actually very thin, only 4 millimeters and weighing about 250 kilos. So it's extremely lightweight for the size of this kind of temporary building. So in a way, synthesizing the capability of the machine with building up the material structure itself, the transparent glass fiber surfaces and the black sort of structural carbon fiber rowings will allow perceiving the logic of the differentiated fibrous organization within the translucent envelope, basically forming all one continuously constructed materiality. So after having introduced the design potentials inherent in designing and constructing somehow synthetic materiality, I will return one last time to wood as a natural composite in order to show how a kind of material-informed design process allows exploring the performative capacity latent even in such mundane building materials, especially if they're combined with the new possibilities of constructing sort of material structure with synthetic composites. So over the last 5 years, we have actually done a series of projects in which we have investigated how one can tap into the inherent environmental responsiveness of wood, which, as I mentioned a couple of times now, is still one of the most common and actually cheapest construction materials we have. So as probably some of you know, wood is a hygroscopic material, which means it maintains its moisture content in equilibrium with the surrounding relative humidity. So the related processes of actually adsorbing and desorbing water molecules affect the microfibrillar structure, resulting both in a change of strength and a differential change of dimension. This is something we usually experience as a kind of deficiency of the material, because the way we come across the dimensional instability of wood is kind of in the form of jammed drawers or wobbly parquet floors. And in fact, we invest more than 70% of the energy in wood processing to suppress this inherent behavior. So you can nicely see that 71% of the energy in the wood processing goes into kiln drying the wood, which is actually meant to reduce the moisture content to below 10%, which sort of guarantees that the wood remains to be sort of dimensionally stable in its subsequent use. So in this project, we were interested in somehow doing exactly the opposite by exploring this sort of humidity responsive capacity of wood. And I think it's important to understand that typically humidity, or let's say climate responsiveness in architecture, is really conceived as a technical function enabled by a myriad mechanical and electronic devices. So in contrast to this superimposition of high-tech equipment on otherwise quite dumb materials, our approach investigated a kind of fundamentally different, actually no-tech strategy. Here the climate responsiveness is really quite literally ingrained in the material itself. A natural example of such a responsive structure is the spruce cone, which probably all of you know grows in a moist, closed state on the tree. Then it falls off the tree. By that time, it's already a dead organ. And once suitably dry environmental conditions are reached, the seeds are actually released by this cone opening up due to the differential shrinkage of the fiber structure during a reduction in moisture content. So what is interesting about that is it's kind of a metabolism-independent plant movement which doesn't actually require any external energy. So based on this principle of translating a dimensional change into a shape change, we developed a climate-responsive composite element in which wood veneer constitutes the reactive layer. So I think this video shows quite nicely how changes in relative humidity, which you can see indicated here by the hygrometer reading on the bottom left, lead to an autonomous shape change of the element that is only triggered by the dimensional change of the veneer. So we have tested the reliability of this movement over many hundred cycles, but as it is a kind of material inherent behavior, the composite shows hardly any fatigue. We've also developed ways of physically programming the responsive behavior of the wood during the production process. So using somehow the same material to start off with, we can now program the resulting structure to either open or close with increasing humidity. So for example, and that's something you can quite nicely see in this video, when relative humidity rises from 50 to 70%, the initially closed elements on the right will open, while the ones on the left actually close. So exposed to exactly the same environmental changes and constructed from exactly the same materials, the two pieces can be physically programmed to respond in exactly the opposite way. And this doesn't entail any sort of electronics or other kind of technical gadgets. So we have tested this behavior in a number of full-scale functional mock-ups and verified the coherency and reliability of the movement in both laboratory tests and long-term tests in outdoor conditions, which we have conducted for over 1.5 years by now. So we monitor the system in environmental conditions every 15 minutes for more than 18 months now, and we can say that the system still performs absolutely faultlessly. Every time rain approaches, it's a physical law that the relative humidity level goes up, and that means the system closes, and it has done so reliably over many hundred cycles by now. It also is surprising to us that the wooden part of that composite is actually not affected by any molds, because the wood that we use has a natural sort of level of acid that prevents spores entering and affecting the wood. So at the same time, and accounting for the more complex reciprocity of the individual elements as well as the overall system responsiveness, we have developed a more adaptive system and related computation design process in order to derive more specific system morphologies. So in this process, the surface geometry is algorithmically generated and controlled through a number of parameters and constraints actually based on the material's anatomy, the characteristics and behaviors, resulting, in this case, in a fully functional prototype. So here, the veneer composite pieces are, at the same time, sensor, motor, and regulating elements. And only given a kind of change in relative humidity, the system opens and closes with no need for the supply of any external energy or any kind of mechanical or electronic control. Here, the responsiveness is quite literally ingrained in the material itself. So currently, we're trying to convince the city of Frankfurt that they need a pavilion with exactly this kind of skin structure, which on a rainy day with relatively high humidity would be obviously fully closed, but once the weather changes and the sun comes out, the related decrease in relative ambient humidity automatically would trigger the structure to open. So beyond fulfilling the merely functional requirements of a convertible building roof, this autonomous passive actuation of the surface would really provide quite a unique convergence of environmental and spatial experiences. Somehow we're still waiting for this project to happen, but in the meantime, we had the chance to develop this system further to the point of an actually fully functioning prototype based on a commission by the Centre Pompidou in Paris for an installation for their permanent collection, actually, which was named Hygroscope Material Sensitive Morphology. So in many ways, the Centre Pompidou obviously embodies the architectural opposite to our approach. In fact, the building celebrates the very technology that maintains the stable interior climate as one of its sort of key architectural features. So based on this, our concept for the installation was to insert into the space of the Centre Pompidou, which arguably is one of the most stable or climatically stable interiors, a kind of virtual extension of the exterior climate in the form of a large display case in which we reproduce the dynamics of the external environment. So you can nicely see here the installation is located on the first floor of the Centre Pompidou, and what we do within that display case is we basically generate the humidity levels that are taking place or that are outside. So situated within the glass case, the movement of the material-sensitive morphology allows experiencing the subtle humidity fluctuations that actually form part of our everyday life, but usually totally escape our spatial perception. In this case, the specific system morphology is computationally derived based on the one hand, the intrinsic material variables and the anatomy of the material we were using, and on the other hand, the extrinsic environmental conditions which we simulated with the help of which were actually simulated by the climate engineers of our project partners for this undertaking, which was Transolar in Stuttgart. So you can nicely see that even within such a controlled environment as this glass box, the humidity levels are very, very heterogeneous. And this heterogeneity provided the kind of input for the computational process that resulted in quite a differentiated morphology, articulating actually 3 concentration points that respond with a different kind of movement to an increase in relative humidity. So as it happens, we also had to build this entire installation in-house, which again entailed fairly elaborate robotic fabrication for the substructure, as well as the production of the many hundred responsive veneer composite elements, which we also did within our lab. So you can imagine that this process is very moisture sensitive. So we had to control and monitor the relative humidity during this and actually during the entire assembly and transport process. Also, because we could simply not find a company that was willing to do the job for us, we also had the interesting task to sort of custom build the climate control unit, which is a kind of mini Centre Pompidou underneath the display case that somewhat undoes the big Centre Pompidou's climate conditioning, which also required quite a bit of intense fine-tuning the code and technical equipment during a couple of long nights. Anyways, the final installation really explores a novel mode of responsive architecture through unfolding material inherent capacities. Here, the material continuously recomputes form and performance in feedback with the environment. So within the glass case, the climate corresponds to an accelerated database of the relative humidity in Paris. And thus one could argue that the case functions less as a separation from the interior space of the Centre Pompidou, but rather as a kind of virtual connection to the outside environment. So the perception of the ever-changing and locally varied environmental dynamics is in this case intensified through the silent movement of the responsive morphology. And in this way, the installation really provides a haptic experience of the subtle variations in humidity levels that we hardly ever consciously perceive. So suspended within this humidity-controlled glass case, the system responds to climatic fluctuations, and a mere increase in relative humidity triggers the system to change its surface porosity to kind of breathe and ventilate the moisture-saturated air. So this wooden morphology, which is really just simple wood with a bit of composite material, with no electronics or anything, really embodies the capacity to sense, actuate, and respond with no need for any additional mechanical or electronic equipment or even the supply of external energy. I think one can really say that here the material itself is the machine. Thank you.
Just fetching a microphone, and Achim has agreed to take a few questions. Questions, anyone? I think you've stunned them into silence. There is one at the back there. Can you pass the microphone?
Hello. I was wondering because almost all of the projects you showed, well, 3 of them, were made out of these understandings of the material behavior, and mostly we were speaking about wood. But there was the only one, which was the pavilion which is being made right now, which is using absolutely different technology, and actually in comparison to other projects, it has like certain disadvantages in a way, in let's say the framework which you have to make, for example, first, and then you have to take it away, and this is becoming a waste of time, of material, and all of these things. So I was just asking, I was wondering if this was something you just wanted to show, or this is something that, I mean, I don't know, it just feels a bit out of this lecture, because everything is more about the material behavior, and then creation of, let's say, structural strengths out of a very simple and very beautiful, in this way, system. While this requires much more work, let's say, and input, different input.
Yeah. Thank you for doing such an assessment of the work sort of for us. We're usually a bit more careful in making this, sort of drawing these conclusions. So I think I would argue what I wanted to do is show 4 sort of fields of research that we are pursuing. I would say that the opportunity is to not use existing materials, but rather sort of construct a material, and that's what's fascinating about synthetic fiber composites, is definitely a very interesting undertaking. Whether this kind of prototype structure that I showed will already kind of indicate that possibility or not, that's probably left for you to decide. But we will, I think, for us it's an important facet to also work with these materials. And as I also tried to allude to in the beginning, we work with a wide range of materials, and we are not a wood building institute. We don't actually even have the expertise to be in a kind of wood engineering institute. It's very important to understand. What I just simply chose to do is to sort of focus a little bit the investigation here on wood, because it shows it shows very nicely that this approach is actually not limited just to exotic materials and very expensive fabrication processes, but it can actually work in context of limited resources. But from my side, I find the carbon fiber and glass fiber work extremely exciting, and I hope that we will come to a different conclusion than you do.
No, absolutely. It's absolutely beautiful and very, very interesting. But I was more speaking about the impact that you have to, let's say, you have to produce the whole table, which actually rotates the whole pavilion, which is like, I mean, I don't really, I cannot even imagine the amount of energy, for example, which is going away, like while you're doing this, this pavilion. It's super beautiful, and I'm not saying anything about the system itself and the use of different material in it, because it's fascinating, absolutely. But this kind of energy thing and first input is
I'm not
questionable.
sure what energy you're talking about, because the robot is the kind of low energy robot, as all robots now are, and the turntable is really not drawing a lot of electricity. I think it's just a very different way of going about it, and actually this is in terms of production, this is by far the highest level of automation we have generated in all these projects now. So I think it really alludes to, or really sort of is a different avenue to actually fully automate robotic fabrication in construction versus a lot of the other projects which still have a part of let's say, robotic prefabrication, but then there's actually a quite standard process of manual assembly. So I think it's actually, I would say, would like to see it in a way that it's an interesting other way of investigating these technologies.
I had a question about the same pavilion actually. What happens when the robot makes a mistake? Because in other projects you talk about tolerances between the wooden elements, but I can imagine in that one if the robot would miss one of the notches or the, like slightly put a wrong string, you lose the entire string. You would probably have to go back for a while. So I was wondering if there's like an inbuilt error catching or error handling in that pavilion.
Do robots make mistakes?
Hardly. It's definitely an interesting question, because I think that process is actually very robust. So actually, if the robot misses one of the notches, and you may have seen in the video, there's a guy standing inside who is actually equivalent to the guy at North Wales who's flying over the sail to do the sort of quality surveillance. The robot missed a couple of notches, but this process is actually not so much driven by geometric precision, but rather kind of topological exactitude. So it actually really doesn't matter if one or two fibers are not in exactly the place that they're supposed to be. On the other hand, the process is actually fairly robust in terms of the robot not making any mistakes, actually. Because we scanned the scaffold with the robot is laying the fibers exactly in the place where they physically are. And actually for the next project, we're investigating possibilities of actually having the robot scanning the framework while he's actually working. So this is actually offline programmed. So you program the robot to do what he wants to do before you actually have it run. Obviously, in such a project, it's much smarter for the robot to know where the next point is and then drive there by scanning the framework continuously, which is also sort of something that's technologically kind of very possible.
Hi. In most of the projects that we saw, there is an in-depth analysis of the material, and there is form on the other hand. And how is the form derived from? Is it derived from the material analysis and all the studies that have been done on the material? And what's the time frame for generating the algorithms that informs the form? Because I see the form as a separate entity, and there's a material computation and studies done separately, and both of these are integrated in all the projects. So how much time do you take for informing the form?
The simple answer to the first part of your question is yes.
Yeah.
The question of time is obviously an interesting one, because, and that's something that I also tried to mention a couple of times, is that there is a sort of substantial investment, time-wise and intellectually, into developing these kind of processes. So within the current sort of economic setting of within an architectural practice, where you actually hardly get paid for the design time, and you just get paid for basically supervising the execution of your design, it's something that is actually diametrically opposed. No? So you invest a lot of time into the development process, and by that you get a very kind of simple and economic construction process. But these projects usually take 1 year, and they involve 5 to 6 PhD researchers working on that, and about 10 graduate students. So, and I would say that usually the kind of percentage is sort of 3/4 of the year development, 3 to 4 months execution. And the last project is a bit longer, because working with a kind of new material, we faced a lot of interesting situations, let's say. So that may actually in total turn into a project that took 1 year and a couple of months.
Yeah, this is just a super simple question. Are the processes scalable?
To be honest, I don't really understand the question, because these processes are one-to-one. And that's
No,
in
no.
their nature.
No.
If you're asking, can you do bigger buildings with these kind of processes, so increase the size rather than the scale, I would say that we definitely hope that this is possible, but without doing all these kind of tests, we will never really know. So I think that's something that we want to work towards too, and we just handed in a research application for doing a larger, actually permanent building based on one of these systems. So this is somehow the next thing on the agenda, but I think it's the nature of research that you have to go through prototypes before you actually really can develop a kind of product, which in this case would be probably a larger scale, more permanent building.
Thank you.
Okay, we can take the last question from Paolo at the back.
Hi, mine's purely a technical question. It's about the project that's shown here. How do the strips meet the ground? Because this is a crucial detail in these types of structures, which was missing in the presentation.
Yeah, there's actually a nice photo. What really happens is that the very thin plywood strip actually meets the ground about 20 centimeters above the ground, and it's kind of held from the back actually just with a simple notch. And you need to keep it sort of elevated 10 to 20 centimeters, because if not, it gets affected by moisture. And then obviously the creep of the wood is accelerated, and it would actually be quite a problem for the structure. So the actual system ends, and you can see that here. No? That's why you have this shadow gap of 10 centimeters. The actual structure ends sort of 10 to 20 centimeters above ground, and then there's a connection element that sits on the ground.
You would need to avoid any
Lateral.
planar.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is that this thing is actually really, I mean, there are two bolts that you can just about see here, but they are only there to prevent guys taking the thing apart. So it's actually really a kind of, all the mechanical fasteners are only there to prevent this from happening. Apart from that, it's just a wood construction only. The lateral, actually, there's not so much, let's say, torsion in these pieces. It's really just bent in one plane.
Okay, I think we'll conclude there. I'd like to thank Achim for sharing some of his astonishing body of work that he's evolved over 10 years since he left the AA, and we hope we see him again next year with another advance and more work. Thank you. We've done that lecture.